In this video, I'd like to discuss movement patterns. Movement patterns are great because they allow us to flexibly combine together different single joint movements. Movement patterns are great because they allow us to combine different Movement patterns are great because they allow us to combine different single joint motions together to flexibly complete a task. One analogy I like to use for this is Lego blocks. I don't know if you've ever played with Lego blocks as a kid, but I did. And even though these Lego blocks are all of various different shapes and sizes, soon you find out that you combine different ones together all the time. So after a while, rather than dismantling every single piece, what you would do is you would leave certain pieces together because you know that you would use those combinations again. We can say the same thing about movement. Let's take a look at the upper extremity real quick. We can say that we have at the shoulder joint horizontal flexion, or just regular shoulder flexion, and shoulder horizontal extension, or just regular shoulder extension. And we have elbow flexion and extension, and these can be performed with the forearm pronated, neutral, or supinated. So as an example, one movement pattern that we might use all the time would include shoulder flexion and elbow extension. Or maybe there's going to be another movement pattern that we use all the time that includes shoulder flexion and elbow flexion. So the fact that we can flexibly combine these things together means that we can complete many different movement tasks. And we can say the same thing about the lower extremity. We can talk about hip flexion extension, and knee flexion extension, and ankle dorsiflexion plantar flexion. And for example, we can combine hip flexion with knee extension, or we can combine hip extension with knee extension, depending on the goal of the task. So when we start combining these things together, we start to see that patterns emerge. And that by combining these different modules together, we create different patterns of movement. Let's go over some of those next. First, consider what we have occurring here. We have a two-joint system here, and in that two-joint system, you see that both segments are rotating in the same direction. Okay, now again, this same direction rotation is occurring in a mathematical sense, not necessarily an anatomical sense. Now, when that occurs, and we have both segments that are rotating in the same direction, you'll note that the endpoint, or that end effector, is going to follow a trajectory that is curvilinear, or curved. When this happens, we call this a swing pattern if it is occurring at a submaximal speed, and we're going to call it a whip pattern if it is occurring at maximal speed. So really, the only way to differentiate between a swing pattern and a whip pattern is to know the speed of the movement. So in these swing or whip patterns, you can see kind of still frames that if we go from position 1 to position 8, or even if we go from position 8 back to position 1, that's going to be a swing pattern, again, if it's at submaximal speed, or it's going to be a whip pattern if it occurs at maximal speed. In this movement pattern, you'll see that here the segments are rotating in opposite directions. The more proximal segment is rotating in a clockwise position, direction, while the more distal segment is rotating in a counterclockwise direction. In this case, we see that the segments are rotating in opposite directions, and that endpoint, or that end effector, is going to move more or less in a straight line. And in this particular case, that endpoint got further away from the origin of the chain. When both segments are rotating in opposite directions, and that endpoint is getting further away from the origin of the chain, we call that an extension pattern. Now, in this video, you see the segments are again rotating in opposite directions. We see the more proximal segment is rotating in a counterclockwise position, and the more distal segment was rotating in a clockwise position. Also note that the endpoint is now getting closer to the origin of the chain. When this occurs, and both segments are rotating in opposite directions, and the endpoint is getting closer to the origin of the chain, we call that a flexion pattern. And again, you see the endpoint moves more or less in a straight line as that endpoint is getting closer to the origin of the chain. And since both segments are rotating in opposite directions, we have an extension pattern. And since both segments are rotating in opposite directions, we have a flexion pattern. So if we go from position 1 to position 8, we have an extension pattern. And if we go from position 8 back to position 1, we end up having a flexion pattern. One thing I'm going to ask you to consider, and this will certainly be a point of discussion in class, is when would you use one movement pattern over another? Now, so far we've been talking about movement patterns as they relate to the extremities. There are a couple of special movement patterns I'd also like you to be able to identify. The first is what happens during gait. During gait, you see that we kind of have this in-between movement pattern. It's not quite a flexion or extension pattern, and it's not quite a swing whip pattern, at least during stance phase. During swing phase, we certainly are going to have a swing movement pattern. But during stance, we kind of have this in-between. And this in-between movement pattern, we are going to refer to as a spring-loaded inverted pendulum. And depending on the stiffness of the pendulum, we will either have a walking gait or a running gait. Next, I'd also like to talk a little bit about the trunk. And in the trunk, in a lot of movements, we will see that shoulder-pelvic separation will be really important. So in other words, we are going to have a rotation of the trunk, and this is often referred to, at least in golf, as the X factor. But we will see this in more than just golf. We will also you can see here the shoulder-pelvic separation, or that X factor we see, both during the pre-swing as well as during the follow-through. But again, we will see this shoulder-pelvic separation in more than just golf. This is a very good illustration of seeing, again, that same shoulder-pelvic separation in baseball. And I'm sure if you think about it, you can think of other activities as well. So those were some of the ideas revolving around movement patterns.